covering, for the overview of the session, life cycles, the stages of Jewish life. Of course, huge to tackle in 1 hour and a half long session. But here we are, we're going to give it a go. First, I want to actually ground us just in the idea that we need ritual for life cycle. And where does that come from? And in truth, I think for me, one of my teachers, Rabbi Cheryl Peretz, the dean of the Ziegler School, taught pretty strongly was that ritual is how we take a moment that could have been really mundane and elevate it, where we take a moment where instead of just, there's a new baby in the house, we make that a holy moment. We raise the level of our engagement with God, with the moment in life, and we raise the engagement and we allow that child an opportunity to start access to holiness. We have a couple going to get married. We make that not just a moment that they have come together and move into a new together, but we raise the sanctity of the moment of allowing them to establish a household together. And when we lose someone, we raise the moment from simply a loss to a moment to have a reflection on who that person was, on what their life was. So all of these life cycle rituals, we're going to do an overview of some of the bigger ones. And there are, of course, many opportunities for many that some do and not all do, that we'll touch on, but not spend as much time on. But I first want to start, I'm going to share a screen, but it is one of the ones that is available for downloading, is this Mishnah from Pirkei Avot. So Mishnah is the early rabbinic text, and Pirkei Avot, the kind of sayings of our ancient rabbis of what are we looking at. And what I love about this one is that the exact ages may have changed as our lives have gone on, but this outlines a outline, kind of an opportunity to look at what life should look like, and in the Talmud's guess as to what a lifetime would look like. Does anyone feel like reading over it with me, for me? In the English is fine. Can you see it? Okay, great. And I'm sure we'll have some time to react to the stages that are suggested here.
It's hard to read. It's very small.
Small? Oh dear.
Yeah. Okay. If you could zoom in on it a little bit.
Yeah. Let me find the zooming in while I'm simultaneously looking at you all. There it is. Was that?
That's better.
Better?
Yeah.
Here, I could probably even go one more and still keep
Yay! That's better.
Okay.
Old eyes.
Tried to lay it out by, of course, longer on the screen, which makes it harder.
That's better.
Easier
Much better
to look at, but harder to see, if that makes sense.
I'll read it if you want.
Sure. Thank you, Tony.
Okay. Pirkei Avot. He used to say, 5 years of age, one is ready for the study of Torah. At 10, for the study of Mishnah. At 13, one is subject to the commandments. At 15, one is ready for the study of Talmud. At 18, for the bridal canopy. Well, at 20, for pursuit of a livelihood. At 30, the peak of strength. At 40, wisdom. At 50, able to give counsel. At 60, old age. Well, at 70, fullness of years. At 80, the age of strength. At 90, a bent body. At 100, as though dead and gone, completely out of the world. Okay.
So not all of them are so flattering on first read, but any gut reactions, any initial, I suppose I should keep it up so we can keep looking at it together.
I think it's interesting that you can become a bride before you can earn a living.
Yes, there are certain things I think that the timing of modern life has probably tweaked a little bit, right?
Well, and I think these refer to man. I don't think these refer to man. Certainly, we were not encouraged to do Torah or Mishnah or Talmud, and we were often not. We also, in the traditional world, we worked while they studied. So, I I think this is more focused on the manliness of Judaism.
Certainly in the fantasy kind of imagination of what the Talmud age of study looked like with the rabbis then, they amend the men doing the study and women less so. Though there, of course, needed to be some study that women would have done in order to keep the house kosher at minimum, for example. But so we could, in theory, if we wanted right now, at least adapt to our own gender equity. There's still certain pieces that obviously the timing has changed. I don't know of anyone who got married at 18. My parents were 20 and considered extremely young. They are together, but many people who got married at their age didn't stay together with their initial partner. So that is one, for example, that has changed. Any other reactions, anything we note about the different stages? Any questions? You can also push back reactions.
I think it relates to things we know to be not events, but things that go on in our synagogue. For instance, children 5 age, is that not when kind of we do at Simchat Torah that we give Torahs to our kindergartners, graders, whatever?
Yeah, about 5 or 6 years old. Yeah.
Right. And then obviously 13, 15, we think about usually consecration or confirmation. So I mean, I see some analogies with some of those events, if you will.
Right. The educational pieces may still be pieces that we do in fact keep true, especially with Torah as our foundational stories. Mishnah, right, around age 10 is about when children start wanting things to be very easy to analyze and very clear and concrete. And the Mishnah, it tries to be a very succinct, analytical, this is just what is. What the Mishnah attempted to be the first round of Jewish law. Then it in your confirmation is what the rabbi said was time for Talmud. The Talmud is much more debate and much more back and forth. And are we sure that things were supposed to be clear in the Mishnah are in fact as clear as they are? There's the debate and the logic. So that's a very true thing to point out, that the educational pieces actually do seem to still fit and still follow developmentally what people are ready for, that most people are ready for as it ages. First story, then concrete, and then logic and analysis. I was also 31 when I got married, Alex. and why is it 40? So let's look at those later so maybe the younger up until 15, right? That's we've kept pretty stable in society. And then somewhere around 18, it starts falling apart for what we still do right now. Any other reactions or notes there? I think I saw Tori start to say something.
And obviously, that 80, the age of strength being in quotation marks, is an interesting one out of all these.
So that we put in quotes. So 30 and 80 both get translated in English as strength, but they are different words in the Hebrew. The 30 is koach, is usually refers to physical strength. At 30, they're saying the peak of physical strength. You're, the fittest you'll ever be, which is, bodes well for me. And then at gevurah is the word for strength used for 80. And that kind of strength is also the kind of might that we'll use to refer to God. There's a mental strength, there's a wisdom, kind of pulling in that wisdom and counsel and fullness of years. And there's just the strength of being a full person rather than the physical strength. So that's why one is in quotes and the other, because they're not the same word in the note. I will say the thing that I love about this particular passage, which we also share with our bar and bat mitzvah families for the family education program when preparing for a child bar or bat mitzvah, is that the specifics are a little bit vague for each person. As an institution, we tend to keep the around 5 is when you start school, around 13 is when we have bar and bat mitzvahs. So some in our communities will be 12 and some will be 14. It's about 13. About 15 is that study of confirmation and Talmud. But throughout life, there's always something more to be looking forward to and to be growing in physical, in mental strength, and giving counsel and emotional strength. There's always something to keep noting and to see, and something more to learn. And maybe we maybe we don't always feel like we hit the specific mark. So that's the one drawback to this Mishnah for me, is that it kind of sets a bar that we may or may not all actually feel like we meet every time, but there's always something new and always something more to grow in some way to get there. And I'll say about these 90 for the bent body and the 100 as though already gone. There's a tradition that at 70 you get to start over. So many will have their second bara at age 83, which means you don't really have to get to 80, 90, 100. You could just start over. So if you wanted to push those ones aside, start over 70. And it's also a note for the reality of where we do see some of our elders, especially in the latest ones here, requesting compassion from us, because that is a time that we do start to see some loss of mental strength for some, especially in that late 90s and closer to 100. Although many who make it there have kept most of their mind. Yeah. And Beth-EL question, is the stage 40 meant to be eligibility for the study of Kabbalah? There is another tradition that says that, that at 40 is when you're ready for Kabbalah, because that's when we were talking about the developmental stages for age, what we can handle. Kabbalah is when is much more mystical and spiritual, and kind of seen beyond what we can see in reality. So there is a tradition that 40 is the age to start studying Kabbalah. Some even take it as if you are under 40, you are not supposed to try. But that's another tradition that certainly is attached in the stages of life. So most of what we're going to do today is really focusing on the specific big life cycle events, events that we use to mark major moments that most people have in their lives. Obviously, not everybody has every one of them. Not everybody chooses to get married, and if they do, not everyone chooses to have a religious-based wedding. Not everybody has children, and therefore not everyone will participate in creating a Brit Milah or a Simchat Bat. But they are the kind of the major life cycle events that most people and most of us will encounter at some point. So if we go through, you all have the access to the downloads, right? I can put the link in the chat if that's simpler to find where everything is housed. That way I can keep making sure that we can see one another's faces without sharing every sheet. So there's the link to download all of the materials from today will be at the bottom, and all of the past ones that you probably have taken a look at already. But any reactions before we jump in, what it is to mark our moments in life? Okay. So I arranged there's lots of different ways that people when teaching about Jewish life cycle events will choose what order to arrange things in. Almost always funerals are last for obvious reasons, but as far as births and bar mitzvah and weddings and what order we'll do things in, some will do the wedding first as the creation of the new family, and then in theory a birth would come after a wedding. I'm choosing to put birth at the beginning, and we'll go through in order that a person might live through, although I don't think many of us will remember any ceremonies that happen to celebrate our own births. But let's do a little bit. So each of the packets has a vocabulary sheet toward the beginning, so that's helpful to kind of look at and guide along as I'm talking and sharing. But you don't have to, but it's kind of a helpful way to kind of outline your notes of what we're looking at for each of them. So I'll give us a moment to download those. Each one will have that at the beginning. There are a couple of articles that I'll be referencing and that are good to look through in more depth later. Well, let's start at birth. Let's start at the very beginning. If you have, is this book on the list also? This Rhythm of Jewish Life or Jewish Time? Sorry. This book also has a chapter to the beginning on the life cycle event, so that's also worth a read later. Okay, so let's start with the life cycle events surrounding birth, surrounding a new baby, a new person to be welcomed into the covenant. Because circumcision features so largely in the birth ceremonies in the Brit Milah, that first word, the covenant surrounding Milah, surrounding circumcision. There are different ceremonies depending on whether the infant is assigned male or assigned female. So we'll start with the Brit Milah, which is for a male assigned baby. Typically that will be at 8 days of life, and is a circumcision ceremony done on the 8th day by looking, which is referenced directly from the Torah, from the book of Genesis, when God tells Abram at the time, to circumcise himself, all of the males in his home, and that any sons born should all be circumcised on their 8th day of life. Isaac is the first one actually circumcised on his 8th day of life. Yishmael, Abraham's older son, was already born and circumcised at 13 years, which I believe is referenced in a tradition that for many Muslim cultures, 13 years of age is a time for circumcision based on that. But we're going to focus on the 8th day of a boy's life. The Torah gives no reason for why on the 8th day, although interestingly, current medical science suggests that that's about when babies develop the ability to clot and where it would not be quite as dangerous. So that could be part of it. And the circumcision was always seen as a physical marker of a covenant with God, a physical marker that this child is part of a community that has a direct and distinct relationship with God. Jews were not the first community to circumcise. You'll see in the article that on the Jewish life cycle, there were other communities that also in the ancient world that also would use circumcision at different times in life and in different ways, or as a replacement for sacrifice. There's some kind of giving up of a piece of one's body to enter into a holy relationship with God. And this is something that is now, it is strongly at the 8th day of life. It can override all of the restrictions of Shabbat or of Yom Kippur or of any other holiday. Normally you wouldn't carry or cut or do a medical procedure in a traditional base on any of those days. But for Brit Milah, for that circumcision, that entering of the covenant, that's always done on the 8th day as much as possible, unless there is a medical reason that would cause a danger to the baby. I had a friend of mine had his son, his younger son was born about a month early with an extreme lack of blood and oxygen. He was an emergency C-section, and had they tried to do a circumcision for him on the 8th day, it would have killed him. He didn't have enough blood for them to even determine what blood type he had, so they couldn't spare this drop of blood as a covenantal sacrifice. And in that space, just as the fact that we're doing this class right now on Zoom and not in one of our rooms, pikuach nefesh, saving of a life, always takes precedence over any other opportunity for mitzvah. So my friend's son ended up not having his circumcision and Brit Milah ceremony until he was about 3 months old. But otherwise, the 8 days is kind of seen as the ultimate goal for the babies. If there's a medical circumcision prior to the 8th day in the hospital, there are we can still do the covenantal ceremonies and the blessings to bring the baby into the covenant. And usually on the 8th day after the ceremony, which is done together with the moil. The moil is a person who is trained to actually do the circumcision. traditionally we say the father should. Most time the father appoints a shaliach, a messenger, or in this case a moil, someone who is trained in actually doing the circumcision, so that the father both doesn't have to suffer the potential psychological difficulty of having to do a medical and a cut to his child, and to make sure that an expert can do it so that the baby has the best chances of healing. So it's very, very common. I think only one case that I have heard of where the father chose to do the circumcision of his son for himself, not that simple. So we have the term moil, which is on our list, which is the person who is the expert at doing the actual circumcision cut, the actual procedure Jewishly. Often especially in modern communities, you may have a doctor who is also a moil, a doctor who is trained in the Jewish rituals. My parents are friends with a urologist who is a doctor who also will do circumcisions as the moil for families. Questions on the actual circumcision at the 8th day. And then we'll get into what the ceremony is surrounding it.
Out of curiosity, does the moil have to be Jewish?
I think typically the moil is Jewish because most of the time he or she will be also adept and trained in the Jewish laws surrounding the rest of the ceremony, not just the medical procedure. But I have heard of having a non-Jewish doctor who is the urologist be able to do it, and then someone else there to help with, like for example, having a rabbi or just someone else who knows of the blessings there to do the rest of it together. So I don't think that I'd have to double check, but I don't think that the person actually doing the procedure is required to be Jewish in any way. Just there should be someone there to help with the blessings to fully raise the ceremony from a medical procedure to a holy opportunity to bring this child into the covenant. So those can be acted as two people separately, and that's pretty common I've seen in liberal circles, though usually because there's an Orthodox moil doing the cuts and a non-Orthodox rabbi helping create the space for in the progressive Jewish space. But I suppose it could be just as easily a non-Jewish surgeon and the liberal, but I have to double check that. Okay. So for the ceremony, there are a few different roles that are on our vocabulary list. There's the kvater and the kvaterin, which are Yiddish terms. One is masculine, one is feminine. These are kind of the godparents for the child. Judaism doesn't have quite as strong a culture of godparents as some other cultures do. But there are often people who are kind of given a special role in this baby's life, as they're often friends or siblings of the parents. And their main role at the Brit Milah ceremony is to actually bring the baby into the room. I had the blessing of getting to do this for one of my friend's son. And I and a friend held a large pillow with the little baby set onto it and brought into the room, where we passed him to the sandak. That's the other word there. And the sandak is the person who is appointed to actually hold the child during the actual circumcision ceremony. And note that these are opportunities to honor other adults in this baby's life rather than just having the parent do all of it. It's a recognition baby into, they're not just coming in to their family. They're not just coming in to be the child of their parents, but they are coming in to be a part of a whole community. And so these roles offer the opportunity for the parents to recognize other adults that they want in this child's life regularly. I got to be the kvaterin for my friend's son, Eliezer, and passed him to his grandfather, who acted as the sandak and held this child during his circumcision, and while his parents were there. And they did the next step of offering the Mishaberach, offering a prayer, and offering his name and sharing his name with the community in the Hebrew for the first time. So these are opportunities. We often look for, I've noticed we as Jews often look for opportunities in life cycle events to bring in others, to recognize that for all of our families, we need the community as a whole. It's one of the things that I find most meaningful about those two roles, the kavater and the sandak roles. Usually the kavater, the kavaterin, usually often two, will bring the baby in, will pass the baby to the sandak. Sometimes the baby will then be put onto the kisei shel Eliyahu, Elijah's chair. This is a chair that is otherwise kept empty, but the baby's sometimes set on this chair for just a moment. And then given to the baby's then given to the moil where he can be circumcised. The kisei shel Eliyahu, the symbolism of this chair of Elijah, has a few different interpretations. Some see Elijah is one of the more outspoken prophets who will who speaks loudly about Jews not doing what they should be doing and the Israelites not keeping the mitzvot as they should. So some see it as kind of a threatening thing. It's the putting the baby at Elijah's chair to say, Elijah's watching, you should do your best to be a good Jew. Or I think the better interpretation, and the one I've heard more often, is that Elijah is the one who will herald the coming of the Messiah. Elijah is the one who will see that redemption is coming and that our world is getting better and better and we are ready for a Messiah. And so Elijah will announce that Elijah is the one who will announce that the Messiah is on the way. And so setting the chair for the baby for a moment on the chair of Elijah is noting that that this child has his whole life ahead of him. He has so much potential to become someone, whether he becomes the Messiah or not, he has the opportunity and the blessing to become a part of the project of perfecting the world and of growing the world one step closer to redemption. That I think is the more common interpretation of why we have the kisei shel Eliyahu, but the other mentioned in that same article. So wanted to give it its due in noting it. After the actual circumcision, during this ceremony, there's some blessings, and then the parents will present the baby's Hebrew name for the first time for the community. Some need a superstition that you cannot share a baby's name for the first 8 days. This superstition, it's not an actual requirement. In fact, my same friend whose son had to wait a few months, they chose to share his name immediately because the Hebrew name is often used, as a way to pray for someone's health. So when they were concerned that this child might not survive, they wanted to get his name out there as quickly as possible so that he could receive prayers for healing. And some will refrain from sharing, many will refrain from sharing a Hebrew name until the Brit Milah or the Simchat Bat we'll get to in a second, which is a ceremony for welcoming a girl into the covenant. Many will refrain from sharing the Hebrew name, at least, if not Hebrew and the English name, until that day, either to kind of keep the family close, give that first week to just the parents and let just the parents know this child's name for the first week, or it can come from a historical reality that not all babies survive the first week. So this is another reason that my friends were, nope, we're going to give this baby his name as quickly as possible. The Hebrew name can then later be used. Many communities will use Hebrew names when you're called to the Torah for any aliyah. Here we do it specifically for bar and bat mitzvah aliyah. We can use the Hebrew name when praying for healing, and Hebrew names will get used upon death, or the Hebrew name will get used in prayers upon someone's passing. So this is the moment where a name is given to a baby boy. Is at the end of the Brit Milah, right after his circumcision. Naming traditions are pretty varied, coming at different parts of the Jewish world. The Sephardic, has gone over Sephardic and Ashkenazic different customs. The Sephardic customs, so Sfarad means Spain in Hebrew. So the Sephardic customs are often the ones from the Spanish and Portuguese part of the world and the parts of the world where those expand to. The Jews, those communities often have a custom specifically of naming a child for a living relative. Often, if it's a son, often he is named for his paternal grandfather. That's a pretty common practice in Sephardic communities. Not a hard and fast rule. It's a tradition, not a halacha, a rule, but it is a pretty common tradition in the Sephardic part of the world to name for a person who is living in the family as a way of honoring that family member. In the Ashkenazic tradition, the Jewish traditions mostly sourced in Eastern Europe, It's quite the opposite. There's a rooted in superstition, but a strong tradition to name the child only for someone who's been deceased, to not name for someone who is alive in any close way. And it is seen as a way to honor the deceased relative and to hope that the child will carry forth something of the spirit of the person that was lost. So that's a very common tradition in the Ashkenazic world, to name for someone who in the family who has been deceased. So I personally am named for my great-grandmother. In the Ashkenazic tradition of something that, hoping that my parents' wish for me was that I could carry forward something from the great-grandmother whom I never knew, but who passed not long before my birth. And it was a tradition to try to link me to previous generations in that way. Any questions on naming traditions or on the milah, the ceremony largely focused on male-assigned infants? In more recent years, so historically for daughters, for female-assigned infants, the naming, there was still the same significance in offering her a Hebrew name and coming up with a name and sharing with her a name either of a living or of a deceased relative, depending on which tradition. And until about the last century, maybe even less, that was usually a ceremony that was done by the father going for an aliyah, going up to the Torah with the baby, and the baby would have her name presented then. It began expanding to, in more liberal traditions, to having both parents go up to the Torah together in communities where women will come to the Torah. And even more recently, there have become a few different versions of ceremonies that are still very much evolving. So I can't even describe what everyone looks like, just the one or two that I have seen. And even the name of it has kind of varied. On our ceremony list, we have Brit Habat, it's the second on the vocabulary list here, or Brit Benot Yisrael. These are pulling on the word covenant. So Brit means covenant, and pulling on a language parallelism to Brit Milah. So instead of a covenant attached to the circumcision, it's covenant of daughter, or the covenant of the daughters of Israel. I have often heard the phrase Simchat Bat, just a celebration of the daughter. You'll hear the word Simcha, happy, a celebration of the daughter. And these tradition, these ceremonies, I can't even say tradition, they're two. These ceremonies have a lot of different varied ways of doing them. Some of them are on the 8th day, just as the baby boys would be on the 8th day. Some of them are on the 30th or the 60th days, which are pulling from different Torah references to how long a mother should wait before re-entering a community to allow her body to heal. So there are lots of traditions as to when and what they could look like. One that I saw that I really loved was the baby girl was placed on a talit, on her father's talit, and different members of the family made a blessing and folded the talit around her to swaddle her in her father's talit. But that's one way that I have seen it created. And in lots of different rituals in development for that. So if anybody has a baby girl or expects to have a baby girl and wants to create something new, this one is wide open for creating something new. And then many of the blessings and the naming elements are very much similar to the Brit Milah, to the boy ceremony, to welcome her in, to bring her in as part of the community, finding ways to honor other adults in her life that will help her grow in all of those. And for both boys and girls, the Hebrew structure of names for any human, the Hebrew structure of names, usually the person's name, and then ben or bat, son or daughter. I have started to hear mimishpachat, from the family of, for people who prefer a non-gendered source of Hebrew naming, and then the parents' Hebrew names. So that's the structure of Hebrew names. Okay, that was the whirlwind, and I don't have a lot of time on everything on birth ceremonies, on ceremonies surrounding welcoming a new baby into the covenant. Any questions on those before we try the next, and I'll leave you lots to read before we try the next stab at the next step. Okay, So the next big life cycle event is the one that's probably the most seen by most of us, especially if we ever come to synagogue on a Shabbat morning, on a Saturday morning, because it's most often done as part of a Saturday morning service, which is the bar or bat mitzvah. The bar or bat mitzvah, we often will call it when we're reaching the age of Jewish adulthood. I like to push back on this. We don't actually think that a 13-year-old is a fully fledged and fully functioning adult. I don't think anyone has ever actually felt that way. But bar or bat mitzvah, rather than meaning a literal son or daughter of the commandment, means someone is starting to be obliged in some way to the tradition on his or her own. In traditional circles, it means you are fully obligated to all of the mitzvot, to all of the laws of Judaism on your own, and breaking the rules now reflects on your own spiritual scales rather than your parents. But it does not mean that you're actually an adult. It just means that you are now starting to reach an age where you can explore responsibility and you are responsible for your own actions. One of my teachers, you can read through the meaning of 13 in more detail, but one of my teachers, Rabbi Ed Feinstein, points out why 13? Any guess why 13 before I read through those? Unless you've already read them, because it was up online. Why 13? Why do we think 13 is good? I'm seeing it. Okay. So we pull, Rabbi Feinstein pulls on a few examples from our Torah. Abraham, there's a midrash, a legend on top of what's in the Torah, that Abraham, at some point, his father owned an idol shop, and there's a statement that Abraham smashed that idol shop. It's actually not in the Torah. It's a pretty known story, but it's actually not in the Torah. It is a midrash. But in that midrash, some say Abraham was 13, because 13, early adolescence, is a time of rebellion, of standing up to what you have been taught and saying, I want to do it this way. Jacob is said to have been 13 when he gets his brother to sell him his birthright, and he takes his own identity above his brothers in the history of the Jewish people. So 13 is the start of a spiritual search and of self-identity. Levi, one of Jacob's sons, is said to have been 13 when he retaliates violently against violence to his sister. So at 13, people are in a state of moral absolutes, is how Rabbi Feinstein puts it, that we start to see good and bad, and good needs to be punished, or good needs to be rewarded, bad needs to be punished. Maybe that's why God has it all backwards sometimes. But good needs to be rewarded and bad needs to be punished. So 13 is the age of absolutes. And then Beth-El is the person who is said to have had the creative and artistic impulses to have made the Mishkan, the traveling holy space of the desert, the tabernacle. Beth-El is the artist who put it all together. And so at 13 is when our creativity shifts from, we can do painting and things as handed them to them, and start figuring out our own sources of creativity, whether they be visual art or music or writing, or scientific. But 13 is about when our own skills and our own creativities begin to blossom. So in summary, we're saying that at 13, one is not fully an adult, but one has started to figure out enough of one's own identity, of one's own sense of morality and creativity, to start pushing back on being just a child of one's parent and starting to be one's own person. So that's why we think, I think, and I agree with Rabbi Feinstein's take, that's why 13 is around when we have bar mitzvah. It's not that we're fully an adult, but we are starting to be our own person. And as a community, we celebrate that with the ceremony, often on a day with a Torah reading, so that the child can say the blessing at the Torah and take ownership of the Torah for him or herself. It's usually when someone is given their first talit, and their tefillin in the factories, the other prayer boxes that in communities that use them. And often the bar bat mitzvah will include a devar Torah, a teaching of Torah in some way, which is also saying that that child has taken enough ownership of his or her own education and that they're ready to share something that they see unique in the tradition. One of the things I like to teach our bar and bat mitzvah students when I'm helping them prepare their devar Torah, their speech, is that we have all have opportunity to have read the Torah before, but we've never had opportunity to read it from that child's perspective before, and we need their unique perspective. And that's when they're showing what they have learned and how they have grown. So those are the childhood, up to the end-ish of childhood life cycle events. Make a pause for just a second so that I'm a little thirsty, so I'm drink some water. And any questions, discussions, or reactions so far? And I'll put the name of the book, Jim, in the chat in a little bit. Yeah, actually, I'll do that right now. Jim Roth Asset's book is called The Rhythm. It's spelled correctly.
So Rabbi Jenny, I have a question, Steph. Because I'm converting and my daughters are 6 and 4 already, Harper has missed her first grade little ceremony. So does that affect her ability then to do her bat mitzvah on time, or does it not really matter?
The consecration ceremony is one that is not as standard as a bar bat mitzvah in every community. It's one that we at Beth-El do with our first graders. But consecration itself isn't a requirement for becoming bar bat mitzvah. In fact, the only requirement for becoming a bar or bat mitzvah is to be a Jew and to turn 13, or 12 for girls in some circles. And is acknowledgement that you're grown enough to take responsibility for your own Jewish practice. So we might have to discuss if she would do her own mikvah immersion. We'll get to conversion. Actually, is the next one I want to do an overview of, though you are all in the process already, so probably more familiar with this one than others. But she wouldn't have to kind of do a makeup of consecration or anything like that. We just want to make sure that she gets as much Jewish education as she can, so she's ready to take ownership of the tradition when it's time for her bat mitzvah.
Thank you.
Yep. The last sheet I have in the page, I'm not going to go over it or say that we need to look at it in detail together, but actually it might be helpful for you, Steph, and for any others. This is a page from a different conversion curriculum that I have seen that has 10 ways to share Judaism with your kids. So if there are kids in your household and you're looking for other ways to simple ways to bring Judaism into the home, they can be Shabbat dinners, it can be making sure that you have Jewish books around, tzedakah boxes, but that's a good page to kind of read over, and I'm happy to go over any with you if you have any questions. And if you don't already have PJ Library for any little ones in your home, let me know and I'll help set you up with receiving their books, because they send really beautiful Jewish books for children, age-appropriate books for children each month for free.
What was that called?
PJ Library.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's on, and that one, their website is on this sheet here. But those ways to share Judaism with children if you wanted to, if you have children in your life already or expecting them at some point. Okay, so let's do the next one that I want to go over is in fact the conversion process, which many of you are in right now. But that only sheet on the next one for looking over the vocabulary list, and I'm going to use that to kind of guide our conversation and see what other questions might come up here. But conversion, the first two on our yellow, well, I guess they probably didn't scan as yellow, on the conversion vocab sheet is ger or gioret. That translated is really just convert. That's the human noun. That's the person noun. It literally in Torah Hebrew, in biblical Hebrew, it usually referred to the stranger who was living amongst a community and was later adapted to mean the convert, the person who chose to come from outside and be a full part of the Jewish community. And my father is a convert, and he said he often had a struggle with the word ger as being stranger but convert, until he came to the realization that we are all said to have been strangers in a strange land. Moses said that of Egypt, and in fact names his first son Gershon, which comes from that same word ger, because he was a stranger in a strange land. So there's not really a Jew who wasn't at some point in some way a stranger. And we're told over and over and over in the Torah to welcome the stranger, for you were once a stranger. And so there's a kind of a community of recognizing that we're all in some way strangers and finding one another. So that's the reason, that's the wording for ger, and where it shifted to become the convert was the stranger living amongst you, the stranger who chose to become a part of you. And the stranger who chooses to be a Jew. Often in English, we'll say the Jew by choice rather than the Jew by birth. So not so much a stranger, but by choice and rather than by birth. Gerut is the conversion, is the process of converting. So those are those two words more simply. Halacha refers to the system of Jewish law and Jewish custom, comes from the word lahalech or holech, which means to walk. It is the path of living a Jewish life. So for some, that might be a very stringent path with very particular rules of what and when and where and why. I think you'll have covered some of them a couple of weeks ago when looking at, for example, the dietary laws and tzedakah and the communal responsibilities. Those are all things that will fall into the umbrella of halacha. But it really comes down to path. It's the way of walking the Jewish path, of finding the elements of Judaism that work for you in the community of Judaism, and the practice of halacha and whatever level of stringency or leniency would work for you. So for Orthodoxy is often seen as the most stringent version of walking that path of halacha. Reform is often seen as the most lenient, the most flexible, and there's lots and lots of shades in between, especially us right here at Beth-El Zedek. We're in shades in between, figuring out how strictly and to walk that path, but also recognizing that we're always on it, whether or not we're strictly following the way that tradition, the way that previous generations have done. We each reconstruct our path in our own time and in our own ways. It's still on that path, on that tradition of halacha. The next major Kabbalat ol mitzvah is one of the requirements of conversion, is recognizing that you want to be on that path. And the literal translation here is to receive the yoke, like that would go on an ox, like not yoke like an egg or the yoke in your shirt, but the yoke that kind of attaches a burden to an animal. Receipt of the yoke of mitzvot, the receipt of the yoke of mitzvot, of commandments, of obligations, of being on that path, of entering onto that Jewish path, with whatever burdens might come with it, in exchange for the joys and the community that come with it. So for someone who takes on kashrut, that might be a burden of picking up your lobster mac and cheese or bacon blue cheeseburgers, or any number of other non-kosher things. That's just all I can think of at the moment. And taking on that burden to be a part of the community is receipt of the yoke of mitzvot, to be a part of the community. So choosing to give up one thing and take on another, and being a full part of our people. And as Ruth says in the book of Ruth, that your people will be my people, taking on that together. We have tevilah, which means immersion. Tevilah refers to the mikvah that we might have heard of. The mikvah is the Jewish ritual bath. It's used actually at a few different times. Conversion is the time that is most known in the liberal Jewish world. but it is a place where we go to become ritually renewed. We'll often see words in the Torah translated as pure and impure, and it's not necessarily a cleanliness in my interpretation. It's when you are purified, if we use that translation, it's a ritual reset. It's becoming ritually clean and ritually renewed. So it is, the mikvah is used for immersion at different points. Some will use it, some women will use it monthly, or female-bodied folks will use it monthly following a menstrual cycle, is something that's mostly seen in very traditional circles. Some will use it just before a wedding, so we'll also see it come up again on the wedding list in just a moment. And we'll use it in conversion, and it's almost a sense of rebirth in conversion. Yes, Tori, like the concepts translated as ritually ready. Yes, you're stepping into something new. So for conversion, it's a sense of rebirth. The waters of the womb, and you're coming out reborn as Jewish. So the born again is not a Jewish concept. The mikvah is that moment in the conversion system where you immerse, and when you come out from, there will be 3 total immersions. Once with the blessing over immersion itself, once with a Shema of claiming God and the God of Israel as the one God and as your one God, and then once with a Shehechianu, a marking of reaching a particular moment and a gratitude for reaching a new particular moment. And that all so Tevilah means immersion and takes place at the mikvah. And Mila, we have mentioned a little bit already in Brit Milah, and it refers to circumcision. So there's a tradition that male-bodied converts would, if not already circumcised previously, should become circumcised before that immersion. And if already, then there's a ceremony called Hatzafat Zambrit, where there's just a little pinprick to a little bit of blood as that same sort of attaching the sacrificial notion of the circumcision to the becoming Jewish, and to that procedure. So that's where our list. Any questions on that one? I'm realizing that I now have half an hour to do weddings and funerals, which wasn't that a movie, 4 Weddings and Funerals? I don't think I saw it, but I saw lots of trailers for it. Any questions on the conversion, birth, bar mitzvah? Just because we've moved on doesn't mean it's not on the table anymore. So let's do a little bit on marriage. I'm going to go briefly through. So if you're looking at the downloads, there's a sheet that looks like this one. If you were to print it, it's supposed to be a booklet. So if you're looking at it in full, it doesn't start here, it starts here, and then comes inside and then goes back to here, because it should be a folded booklet. So I hope that makes sense. So Jewish wedding ceremony has lots of parts. I think that it is probably the one that I'm most aware of, the most different places that we have pulled in all kinds of different symbology. If we have time, I will show you a few pictures of my own to kind of look overview of the ceremony itself. I'll make time if you want to see my pretty wedding pictures. It starts with a couple coming together, quite simply. In traditional Jewish law, I've heard about arranged marriages and that there wouldn't be love, and it's actually even in the oldest, most traditional Jewish law, a woman can always say decline a marriage. In the Talmud, a woman is not required to marry someone just because her father, even given that context, says that she has to marry a particular man. Judaism has always held consent to be tremendously important. There's also a legend in the Talmud of a non-Jew coming to one of the rabbis and saying, okay, so your God created the entire world and got everything going, but what's God been up to since? And in the legend, God says, the rabbi says, God's been arranging marriages and helping find people who need one another and bringing them together. And this non-Jew is, I think she's supposed to be, I don't remember her name, but she's supposed to be this like wealthy non-Jewish queen who said, well, I can do that. And so she just sort of randomly matches up her servants, men and women servants together, and they're great. See, I arranged marriages. What now? What's your God? What's so great about your God? And within about a week, there's turmoil and destruction and divorces and anger. And she comes back to the rabbi and says, "Okay, you're right. Finding the beshert, finding the beloved, the meant to be, is not so simple." So there's a lot going on in bringing it together. And this is absolutely one of the ways I think at the beginning of saying the cycle events are meant to elevate a moment that could be mundane to something holy. We know that the birth of a new child is going to rock a world no matter what, and that the loss of a loved one will rock someone's world no matter what. And this is an acknowledgement that finding the right person and establishing a household is so much more than just meeting someone and moving into a house together, that it too should have the elevated moment to rock someone's world and fully enter them into a space of kiddushin, of holiness. So we'll go through all of that. So kiddushin is the name used for weddings in the Talmud and in Judaism, and it comes from the root of kadosh, holy. Because in a wedding, you are setting aside one other person in the world to have a particular kind of holy relationship with. The person who coordinates a wedding is called a mesader kiddushin or mesaderet kiddushin, which means they're someone who organizes holiness, is the way I like to put it. But the wedding officiant is called the mesader or mesaderet kiddushin. But the translation is someone who organizes holiness. These two people will make a ketubah. Ketubah is the Jewish marriage contract. They lay out what the couple expects to offer to one another. Traditionally, we're looking at much more transactional, what economic values are the two partners bringing to the marriage, and many will still use that same older traditional ketubah language, but also write their own. So this is an opportunity in modern Judaism to kind of bring in your own values and vows, to kind of write out in a ketubah what do you hope to give and get from one another in a wedding. I have seen some will use Hebrew, and then the English is not a translation of the Hebrew, but is sourced by the couple themselves. And it's an opportunity to write together because in reality it has Jewish legal significance, but not civil legal significance. And its Jewish legal significance is really only attached to the get, which is the divorce documents at the bottom, if that became necessary. But in truth, it's the ketubah in modern practice is an opportunity to share with one another, to make those vows with one another in writing and signed, sometimes by yourself, but most traditionally signed by witnesses. By others saying, yes, we see this couple and we see who they're becoming, and we are on behalf of the entire community of the people of Israel saying that these two people are now a distinct couple and a household and have come together. Chatan and kala on our vocabulary list are groom and bride, respectively. At this point in liberal Jewish movements, I can't speak to Orthodoxy, but there we have seen weddings with shnei chatanim, two grooms, or shtei kalot, two brides. You will have a chatan and a kala, or a bride and a groom and a bride in many places together. But that's the name for the bride and the groom, or the groom and the bride. I have them in the wrong order for the way we say it in English here. And the chuppah is the marriage canopy. It is traditionally open on all four sides as a symbol of Abraham and Sarah's tent of welcoming. So if you looked at the opening chapter or the book of the Torah portion, Vayera, so Genesis chapter 16, I think. I might be off by one there. You see Abraham and Sarah are said to have a tent that's open on all sides, where they welcome all in. And the chuppah, the marriage canopy, is also is open on all sides so that all can witness this couple becoming a household, and so that their household will be one that's open and allow any and everyone in the community in when a COVID vaccine is, fully out and everyone has taken it and we're all fine. This is symbology of the chuppah. The ring, or taba'at, comes from the tradition that in order to enter this kind of holy ceremony, there should be an exchange of something of value. In the Talmud, that could have been anything of monetary value. It could have been the contract, the ketubah, or it could simply be a sexual transaction. And in the modern wedding ceremony, we actually pull in all three. So the ketubah was the contract. The ring, traditionally, this is the one my husband gave to me at our wedding, is something of monetary value. For many, it's one that's kept completely plain. So many of us will have an engagement ring where there's something pretty, but the wedding ring itself might be completely plain so that it's easy to tell what its monetary value is, to show that you're truly exchanging something of value. So I think, that we know that's of value too. I just don't know how much. So that's the something of value. And many will have a tradition of yichud, which is a little bit further down our list, which is after the wedding ceremony. The couple is left alone for a little while to share and enjoy the first few moments of being husband and wife, and we don't ask what they're doing in it. So that's the ring. When exchanging the ring, and this is on the little booklet on the bottom of the inside page, there's a formula that you say with this ring, with this exchange of something of value, you, the other person, are now consecrated to me as husband, as wife, as partner, according to the laws of Moses and the faith of Israel. So that's the ceremony. In traditional ceremonies, it need only be said by the husband to the wife, by the chatan, the groom, to the kala, the bride. Most liberal communities, Beth-El, we do this, will do mutual. So it's not just a husband consecrating a wife to him, but also a wife or the other partner consecrating, sanctifying the other person to them, so that each is connected to one another with an exchange of the rings. And technically, in traditional ritual, that exchange of rings is actually engagement. It's not actually the wedding, but for the last several hundred years, all of these are done on the same day rather than sometimes up to a year apart. But we did have precedents in Judaism for an engagement party. We just have more recently combined them into the one day, one ceremony. And so there will often be some way to kind of disrupt in between the two steps of the ceremony. So often that's where the rabbi will say something to the couple as a charge of what they can be for one another. It's a time where the ketubah can be shown and read to the community, but as a way to create a distinction between erusin, that first part of the ceremony, to the nisuin, the second part of the ceremony, where there are sheva brachot, 7 blessings. And I gave you a copy of what those 7 blessings are. I mean, there are 2 pages in that PDF for you to look through. Those are the blessings that are to consecrate the actual marriage. So instead of the engagement, they consecrate the actual marriage, that are concluded with a Kiddush cup. Both sections are concluded with a Kiddush cup and the drinking of wine to solidify the moment spiritually. And then at the very end of most Jewish wedding ceremonies, at least the groom, sometimes I have seen both partners, will break a glass, which has many interpretations of the symbology. Some say it is a reminder that of the destruction of the ancient Jerusalem, which is a moment of mourning. It is a reminder that though we are in a beautiful world and in a wedding, feeling particularly excited and celebratory, there's still pain in the world. And we hope that this couple will themselves, and perhaps if they have children, create children who can address the woes of the world and lead to further joy and to further growth. Let's see, did I cover everything on this list? It's good to have this vocabulary list. It means I can't forget something. Ufruf, and ufruf is a Yiddish term. Ufruf is a way to kind of expand out the wedding celebration from the wedding day itself to the Shabbat before, where either the groom or both members of the couple, if in a liberal space, will come to the Torah and say an aliyah together and allow everyone at the Shabbat service who might not be able to come to the wedding itself, but who might be at Shabbat services to get to celebrate with the couple. The mikveh, often the bride, but most often the bride, but again, it could be both members of the couple, will go to the mikveh and ritually, what do we say, become ritually ready for the wedding and be ritually reset and ready for a new stage of life. Some have a tradition of fasting the morning of the wedding until the ceremony itself occurs. That's why fasting is on that list. Then Chanukat Habayit, and hear the word Chanukah in it. We've got Chanukah coming up. So Chanukah means to dedicate. So the holiday of Chanukah is a celebration of the rededication of the second temple in Jerusalem when the first was destroyed, and they dedicated the second temple. So that's what Chanukah as a holiday celebrates. Chanukat Habayit is what's happening at a wedding. We are establishing or dedicating a house, a new household of this couple together as new leaders of the house. And in doing that, in establishing the physical house themselves, the couple might put up a mezuzah. I don't have one on this interior door, but at least on the exterior door of the outside of the house. Some will put them on every door in a building, except for a bathroom. The mezuzah contains the words of Shema to mark the space as a holy space. And so a wedding helps to establish a new house, which would have a mezuzah and the tzedakah box, an opportunity to give back. I know you talked a lot about tzedakah with Rabbi Dennis in the last session 2 weeks ago. We hope for a shalom bayit, peace in the household, a good functioning of the two together, creating a house of peace and a house that will produce further peace as we go forward. The last one on this list is get. Get refers to the divorce document. So if a marriage needs to be dissolved, Judaism has had precedents for this since the Talmud. There's an entire Masechet, an entire tractate of Talmud called Gitin, looking at the laws of divorce. And a divorce document is one where a member of the couple will give to the other. Traditionally, the husband would give to the wife a document stating the intention to dissolve the marriage. And this will be done in front of a Beit Din, a religious court, so that there is witness and known in the community. And this reflects the witnesses who signed the ketubah, the initial marriage document, so that everybody will know. Any questions on the overview of the wedding? Would you like to look at some pictures to kind of see a brief?
I'd like to see some of the pictures.
Okay, so I'm gonna I have to make sure I find the right way to do it. Share. Oops. Oh. That's not how I wanted to do it. Present. These are some selected pictures from the wedding. I had to do from the each of the major pieces of the ceremony. I will give the caveat at the beginning. My husband and I also participated in two traditions that not everybody does. Many prefer to do these two pieces rather than a big celebration with everybody there as a kind of a smaller opportunity to be with just the closest members of the family. So they're not on our vocabulary list because we see them single ceremony, but I will show them to you as well. So this is the before the ceremony. Your face is wearing some of my pictures for me. So in there's something called a groom's tish. And this is an opportunity. Traditionally, the groom will give some kind of teaching of the Torah, almost like will give some kind of teaching of Torah before, mostly so the bride has time to get ready. And traditions where this happens, this is often a completely gender segregated space. For my husband, he's right here, and we did not do we had the Kabbalat Panim, which I'll show you in a minute, which is a ceremony traditionally done for brides. But we did not actually restrict it to only men at the groom's tish and only women at the Kabbalat Panim. But that is something that some will do if these are at all. These are traditions, not really they're not required attachments to the weddings, and many choose not to do them because it adds more time in more places. But they can be quite fun if one wants wanted them. So often at a tish, the groom will attempt to teach Torah, and you'll notice my dad over here is pouring a fair amount of whiskey. Many of the people in attendance, though probably not good for the groom himself. Again, he might be fasting. We have celebratory assistance, and often the groom will get interrupted pretty regularly with pictures or with he's trying to teach, and people will get interrupted with song. He'll get interrupted with in celebration. It can be kind of raucous and overwhelming, which is why I chose not to do, as some of my friends have done, to have a bride's tish as well. I felt like that would be too overwhelming for me. So I chose to stick with a Kabbalat Panim, which is the traditional, if you're going to do these traditional space for the bride to welcome in, again, traditionally just the women, but I did it, I think it started out that people still self-selected, somewhat segregated, but did not stay that way. Kabbalat Panim means receiving a face. And this is when often the bride will sit. My veil is not yet covering my face in my day. And this was one of my rabbis, Rabbi Sean Fieldmeyer, inviting others and creating the space. And we had songs, and people often share blessings and hopes with the bride. So here's one of my mother-in-law's friends sharing a blessing with me. After those are done in separate spaces, often the groom will then be brought over to where the bride is. And see, we did have, see, this is women. We did have a mixture of people in both spaces, and he's brought over where he will get to see the bride. And then we have the signing of the ketubah. Again, his offices are, most traditionally, the witnesses are not related to the family. So if we're looking at the most stringent version of following the halacha, of following that ritual traditional path, you don't have a member of the family be the son signing ketubah of their family, of the brides, the grooms, of either partners, so that it's truly an acknowledgement of the entire community that that these two people are becoming a couple, and we don't want to, and we don't have the family member because they're no ga'at, that they're no ga'at b'davar, no ga'at b'davar, that they're attached to the proceedings, that they might have some ulterior motive, and so we have one member do it to say truly the whole community is in on this. And this ceremony is called the bedekin. This is one, if someone needing to wear a veil for the wedding, which is the most traditional form, the other partner will bring the veil over the face. And this is another reference to the tradition coming from when Jacob came to the wedding with his bride already veiled, and did not find out until afterward that it was Leah and not Rachel whom he had intended to marry. It was Leah under the veil, not Rachel. So he ended up married to the wrong person. So we now have a ceremony called bedekin, where if we are talking about a heteronormative couple, where the groom will veil his bride for himself. He'll see that she is who he intends her to be, and then puts the veil on over her face. So this is one where you see me doing it often. This one, we did this in this public space with all of our family celebrating together, but it is very common that be just the people that you see in this particular picture. Behind the photographer, there are a lot of people in this picture. But in truth, here are myself and my husband. These are actually my parents and his parents. We swapped who was going to offer an initial blessing. This was our rabbi, and that was it. But so we'll have that sometimes be a very public and celebratory moment, and sometimes it'll be an opportunity for a quiet, holy moment for just the immediate family that's involved in the wedding. And then we'll move to the chuppah itself. Here is my chuppah, open on all four sides. Here is my ketubah. The ketubah has become an opportunity for some artwork these days. We chose, often you'll see a talit. It's not required to be a talit, but often you'll see a talit as the top of the chuppah. We actually chose to stitch together all three of my husband's and my Jewish grandfathers had passed away before we were able to get married. And so we stitched together all three of their talitot. And my father's father, who was not Jewish, we have a pin of his, which isn't as visible in the picture, but he is tacked onto my mother's father, so that our grandfathers were in our chuppah. So that's a place that a couple can bring in something of their own history. It's a room for creativity in the wedding process. And I see as a question, the signing of the ketubah takes place around the same time as the bedekin, when the two are brought before actual ceremony. So traditionally, coming into the chuppah, we're used to seeing the given in traditional Jewish weddings. The groom is also brought in to the chuppah first, before the bride is. In some circles, the groom will be brought in both by his father and the bride's father, and the bride will be brought in by the mother. And in most liberal ceremonies today, each will be brought in by their own parents. So my husband was brought in by his parents, and I with my parents, was how we came in. And then this is that first step, that erusin, that engagement step, exchanging rings with one another. And we each said a formula to sanctify the other to us. We did a pause in between that erusin, and here is my teacher everybody and presenting it as a place to pause, and then Rabbi Vogel, who was also officiating and is currently here hidden, then moved forward with, we have our kiddush and these pictures. I'm covering pictures. Here where we're wrapped in the talit, some traditions have the chuppah, some have us wrapped, the couple wrapped in a talit. So here we're wrapped in a talit, and our rabbi and cantor are saying the 7 blessings, those sheva brachot, to really sanctify the wedding. And often happens, weddings amongst them, most Jewish celebrations are marked with wine, with kiddush. Even starting and end of Shabbat, with our Shabbat kiddush and Havdalah, we use wine to mark moments a lot. So here it is marking the actual moment, and then there's my husband smashing the glass. That was the very quick overview of what the wedding actually looks like. I feel like sometimes it's probably helpful to see it and not only hear about it. So happy to have shared that with you. Any questions on weddings? Well, I realize we have minimal time left for funeral. Now, you can always either throw chats or reach out and ask questions of me, of Rabbi Dennis, as we move forward. So the final life cycle event is, of course, the one that is the least optional and the saddest. It's the unfortunate reality of life is that death comes with it. And in Judaism, we do a lot to really mark the moment of death as a moment to both care for and sanctify the life that was lost, and to then move as quickly as possible into offering comfort to the mourners, to those who have lost a loved one. So we have, let's, if you look on the list, we can go through. Gehinom is one of the words offered for for an afterlife. It is probably the source of the Christian concept of hell, but did not really take hold in Judaism in the same way. It is some kind of turmoil space in the afterlife. And Gan Eden at the end is the garden. On the bottom of our list is Gan Eden, is a heavenly space. Sheol is another word for Gehinom. These are spaces of an amorphous, not really understood afterlife of Judaism. I did put in an article to the end of the packet if you wanted to look at it, by Rabbi Harold Schulweis, who's looking at immortality through goodness and activism, which is a common Jewish interpretation of afterlife, that we live on not by our souls being in some kind of afterlife, but we live on by what we have created in our lifetime and what we have taught those that we leave behind and what they will carry forward. So there's a little bit on the terms on the afterlife, which I'll set aside because those weren't a much more than a 7 or 8 minute conversation that we have time for right now. The first on our list is kavod, which literally translates to respect of the corpse, of caring for the body. So tahara and tachrichim and chevra kadisha are all related terms to kavod hamet. The first and most primary obligation when a person passes in Judaism is to take care of the body of the person who's passed. Their first focus is on the person who passed, and then our second focus will be on the mourner. So we start with caring for the body. Tahara comes from tahor, which is that word for purity that we were mentioning earlier, of ritual readiness. And so tahara is the cleaning of the body. And chevra kadisha means holy friends. It's a holy friend group. Chevra kadisha are usually a volunteer group of people who do the work of tahara and tachrichim, who do the work of cleaning a body and caring for them, for making them ready to be buried. Tachrichim refers to the burial shroud. We traditionally, a Jew is buried in a very, very plain, simple, often white shroud, just a basic covering. And this is regardless of economic status in life. The symbology meant to be that in death, we are all equal. That in life, there may be hierarchy, there's strain of lived society, of some getting more than others economically and socially in many ways, but that in death, Judaism holds very strongly that in death and as a soul is returned to God, every soul is equal and every body is prepared as similarly and as simply as possible. So tachrichim are simple burial shrouds. They look a lot like kittel that some will wear. Some men will wear. You might have noticed in the actual pictures. My husband was wearing a white thing over his tuxedo. That's a kittel, which is actually a reference to the shroud, to the same shroud. That these moments of utmost holiness, we want to be most angelic and most equal to other souls. And that's typically what someone would get buried in, is either called tachrichim, or they might be buried in their kittel if they have one. And then El Malei Rachamim is one of the prayers said at a funeral. I didn't end up including it, but I saw an outline. Let me see if I can find it. I saw an outline of a Jewish funeral service. You'll notice most of the page is blank because it's about who the person is. We have a couple of, you might say a couple of psalms. You say this El Malei Rachamim, this a prayer that says, God, full of heavens, when the Hebrew name given at birth will come back, and offer opportunities for hesped, or eulogizing, saying a eulogy and marking the lessons that this person was taught and who they were in life. And then they are buried. Once the body is buried, the Jewish primary focus shifts immediately to the mourners. Traditionally, mourners are one of 7 people. They're either the father and mother, the brother or sister, husband or wife, spouse, and sons or daughters. Those are the traditional 7 mourners. The way one of my teachers framed it is, if you're looking at parents and siblings, is the family, your family of origin, and spouse and children is the family that you've created in life. And those are those closest nuclear family members are the primary mourners that the community is to take care of as best as possible. Those people are the ones who will do kriya, which is tearing some kind of piece of clothing. This comes from the Torah. When Jacob believes that Joseph, his son, had died, he tears his garments. We see several other places in the Torah where people either put on sackcloth or tear their garments. And it is a sign of something in the fabric of that person's life has been torn, it's been broken. Often it will be an actual garment, clothing, and most often today we'll use little ribbons so that people don't have to actually tear their clothing and create problems with potential immodesty. So some will use like little ribbons attached. I don't have one right next to me, but little ribbons attached to a pin that they can put onto their shirt to show that their heart is broken and something in the fabric of their life is torn. One of the things they did create or did include was this mourner's path. It's on your sheets, and that refers to the timing of mourning. where the person mourns. We start with right after the burial. We start with 7 days of the most intensive mourning called Shiva, which comes from the word both for sitting and for seven. Whereas 7 days, those mourners will sit in their homes. Traditionally, won't go out to do anything, and will traditionally, ideally, will be able to do this for one another again and not on Zoom. People come and offer consolation and offer food and just are present and allow the mourners the opportunity to have that really intensive period of mourning right after the loss of their loved one. Traditionally, if you are visiting a Shiva house, meaning you are going to see someone who is in that initial sense of mourning, you can bring food to help take care of them, because they're not going out and they're probably not in the headspace to cook for themselves. You can offer to do a prayer service with them. You can offer to be part of a minyan. And additionally, you're supposed to just sit with them quietly and allow them to open the conversation and speak when they're ready. But it is not a bad place to offer some questions of, what's your favorite memory of that person? What did they mean to you? Tell me a story about them. But traditionally, if you don't know what to say, it's actually traditionally okay, and frankly, potentially preferable to not say anything and to wait for them. After that first week of Shiva, a mourner will move into Shloshim, which means 30, which is why it's 30 days long. And this is a similar period of mourning. You begin going back out into the world. And really the Shiva, those 7 days, are part of these same 30 days. But you begin going back out into the world. You can go back to work if you are someone who took the time off of work. Often people won't listen to music or go to parties during that Shloshim time, but otherwise kind of start to go back to their normal work. And then the period of Kaddish, traditionally only done for parents, to keep going for the 11 months. For Shloshim, you would be saying mourners Kaddish for anybody if you're one of those 10 primary mourners. And then if it's a parent who was the one who was deceased, people will continue saying mourners Kaddish for 11 months. And yes, I'll come back to the graveside things pretty quickly. I just wanted to kind of give an overview of what's on the list. After Kaddish, there's an annual tradition on the Yartzeit, is the Ashkenazic term, the anniversary of the death. I've heard Años, meaning year, for the Sephardic Spanish tradition. Comes from the same word. Yizkor means to remember, and there are different points on our calendar where we have, as part of the service, inserted into a holiday service, an opportunity to remember loved ones. We have a Seudat Havra'ah, a meal provided to the mourners right after they've come back from burial, so that they can eat for the week while they're not going out and not ready to really cook for themselves. It is a mitzvah to be a part of helping someone mourn, and to create a minyan, create a space for them to be able to pray, and tzedakah, Shaol and Gan Eden a little bit. Those are the traditions from the mourner. At the graveside, when someone has passed away, we will traditionally, the casket will be lowered in. Judaism, we don't really do a viewing. Traditionally, the casket is already closed. And at the graveside, the casket is lowered in. Again, we would say some psalms. El Malei Rachamim would be repeated here, as well as in a funeral service. And then people will do what is called Chesed Shel Emet, a truest kind of kindness, which is where we bury the person. And it's called Chesed Shel Emet, this loving kindness of truth, because it's kind of seen as one of the largest pieces of chesed that you can do for one another. Loving kindness is one that someone can't do for you in return. If you participate in filling in the grave, obviously the person for whom you are doing that chesed, that loving deed of loving kindness, won't be able to return it for you. So it is seen as a true form of loving kindness to take care of that body, so that the body is covered and able to, the soul can be able to reunite God and move on in whatever way that might be. So at the graveside, often there, as many who are able will come and help put in shovelfuls of dirt. Some will use the shovel upside down as a sign of not wanting to actually be doing this, which slows down and makes more difficult the task and allows mourners to linger. Because in truth, I think that part of our process and why we have that spread out sense of mourning is that we acknowledge that we don't actually think it's probably good psychologically to rush from our grief. That Judaism wants us to spend the time for that week and then a little less in the month and a little less in the year in that space of grief. So at the graveside, there will be sometimes ways to kind of slow down the actual burial. It is traditional to wash one's hands after leaving a cemetery, because the cemetery is seen as one of those places where we are ritually in contact with something impure, something that is something that most of the time when we see the word impure, there's kind of contact with death. There's a recognition that life is finite, that life is not going to go on forever. And so there's a ritual hand washing as a ritual reset from leaving the cemetery. And some will also have that outside of the door of a Shiva home before going in. Hard-boiled eggs is not a tradition that I have seen everywhere. I'm not as familiar with that one. Someone mentioned the hard-boiled eggs just to me in the chat. But hard-boiled egg, I think I've seen it with regards to fast holidays, like Tisha B'Av. It's a very simple and bland food. And when in a moment of high grief, you're probably not excited to have particularly delicious and spicy foods. So that's probably where that tradition comes from, but I'm not sure. And it may also be the cyclical nature that it's similar to we have it on the Passover Seder plate, that life is cyclical. And for the Ashkenazi tradition, if someone has passed, we might use their name, cycle back to birth, might use their name and offering a Hebrew name to a next generation. Okay. I acknowledge that I've gone over time and that wasn't enough time on the specific funeral and death rituals, but I want to offer an opportunity for any questions on anything that we have kind of gone over very quickly this morning, and to respect your time. If you need to go, then I understand, but I'll stay on for 5 or 10 more minutes if people have any questions. I want to say thank you all. Next week, I'll go there in just a second. Next week, because otherwise Rabbi Dennis will be I will be remiss. Next week, Rabbi Dennis will be back on. He's taking a bit of much deserved time off this month, but he will be on next week with Isklar for a joint session next week together. Let me double check what the subject was called for you. You will be doing it with Rabbi Dennis and David Starr on issues contemporary Jewish life and communities, looking at Israel, anti-Semitism, interfaith relations, and the pursuit of racial justice. So we'll do next week. Rabbi Dennis will be on with all of you to cover that subject. And this week on Monday, I think Jackie already pointed it out, but Monday night, tomorrow night, we will have our Cocktail Judaism with looking at moving forward with some younger experts in politics and moving forward and following up from our actions. Those are plugs for what's coming next. Now, if you need to leave, I understand, but if you have any other questions on what we've gone over today, I will hang out for a few minutes.
Thank you, Rabbi. I had a question specifically about funerals and the mourning process, and it's something that I'd imagine is relevant to a lot of us who are here for, in part because of conversion processes, but could also be relevant to other people, which is what does the process look like when you have someone who is Jewish mourning for someone who is not?
It can look much more, and actually, I'll speak from pretty recent somewhat personal experience on this, as well as just in general. It can look very similar to a normal Jewish mourning process, and it can look different. And a lot of that will truly be partially from the wishes of the deceased who's left behind. So recently, about 2 months ago, my father, who converted, lost his mother. So my grandmother, who was not Jewish, passed away 2 months ago. And so that becomes the question. So she wished to be cremated, which is not something that traditionally many Jews choose as a way of taking care of a body after passing. But my grandmother wished to be cremated and to have her ashes scattered at sea. And so for that sense, the graveside piece of Jewish mourning, we set aside out of respect for her and to do as she wished, and frankly, as my dad's siblings would want. But my dad also chose to take on, and traditionally there are no must nots in this situation. My dad chose to take on the period of Shiva, of sitting for that week, and allowing friends to share with him. We had to do it over Zoom, but allowing friends to share with him memories of his mom. And I was there for a couple of days back in October to allow us, as the Jewish section of the family, to hold her in the way that we would be used to. That time we chose to do it in rather than traditionally Shiva begins after the burial. Because of the situation of needing to wait for cremation to take place, we chose to do the Shiva right away. Because Jews will often, graveside is something that most traditionally Jews will try to do as quickly as possible. We don't really wait around for funerals in Jewish circles. So we chose to go ahead and do a sort of Shiva space right away. And my dad is saying Kaddish for his mother for this year, but it's not a requirement. And thank you, Heather. So that's kind of where it really will it ends up falling out. And most often that's the case of a convert losing their non-Jewish parent, is a pretty common one, or a sibling, unfortunately. But then it becomes up to the person of what is the meaningful mourning procedure for you. So for my dad, a Jewish mourning procedure was what was most meaningful for him. And I have heard of other converts who will do it as their parent or whatever, or whomever the person they lost would have wanted, and let it be. So it becomes what's most meaningful for the mourner, because the community will be there to care for you. Oh, and I saw that someone, is that good? Does anyone have a follow-up on that question? I saw that someone had put, what is Sheol? Sheol is the term in the Torah that kind of means a down place. It's like Gehinnom, one of those places that is kind of seen as a suit. It's not, it's what's on, because we're very vague on our afterlife beliefs in Judaism, mostly because none of us know for sure. And so we focus on this life, but Sheol is one of the words that kind of means a down place. And the Torah, it's a place where when the earth opens up in the book of Numbers, and there's a rebellion against Moses, fall into Sheol. And it may also, like Gehinnom, be part of a sort of space where the hell concept came out for other cultures. And then, does the mourner say Kaddish from then or from only a period of mourning? So mourner's Kaddish. So there's an article I encourage you to read that I included on that PDF of an experience that one woman had when saying Kaddish for a family member. The mourner's Kaddish is not really for the person who passed away. It's really for the mourner. Traditionally, the mourners will say it for either the 30-day period, so starting from the moment that the body is buried for 30 days, if we're talking about a child, a spouse, or a sibling, or for 11 months if it's a parent who was the deceased. And then again the mourner's Kaddish will then be again said every year on a yard site, which is on the anniversary of the day that the deceased actually passed away. So most of the time you will start mourning practices once burial happens, but the yard site will be the day that the person passed away. So if there's a few days in between, the yard site is on the day they died, but they'll start Shiva, Shloshim, and the 11 months from the day that the body is buried. Actually, the 11 months is also goes from the day that the person died. The Shiva and Shloshim will go from the day that the person was buried. You can say the Kaddish for any or all of those periods of times, because there's actually, there are a lot of pervasive traditions about the mourner's Kaddish that many will participate in, but it's also one that's not as strictly Jewish law for some. Did that answer the question? Okay. Okay. Any others?
Rabbi Jenny, I had a question that was sort of related to Tori's question. Over my lifetime, I've been invited many times to funerals that involved an open casket. And up to this point, I've always avoided that part of the activity and either joined up before or after, because it was always my understanding that such things were forbidden to Jews. What was I off the mark, or was I being overly observant or misunderstanding?
I don't think it's as far as explicitly forbidden, but it is considered, traditionally it's considered disrespectful to the person who passed away. And so most of the time it's kind of like cremation, and it's not actually as forbidden as people think it is, especially around moments of death. People want to be as strictly adherent to the law, and so things that are traditions kind of get pushed up to the status of being law. Open caskets and cremation are both examples of ones where they're not explicitly forbidden, and yet they may as well be by the traditions, the way that most people do them. It's like, yeah, it's forbidden. It's not forbidden, but it's not done. And in the case of the open casket, it's kind of as to the body, and some people feel like they need that one more chance to see their loved one. And so ARN here will allow it for the immediate family, but they'll close the casket before most people arrive for the service. So if the immediate family wants one more chance to see their loved one, they'll make that available. But traditionally, it's not something that's kind of a part of. It's certainly not made a big part of the funeral service where everybody would go and look like we might see in a Catholic ceremony. So it's not forbidden, but it's not done, as someone put it. And the same is true for cremation. It's not forbidden, but very, very, very few Jews choose to do it and are very uncomfortable with it. But more and more Jews are choosing to do it, especially in progressive and liberal circles, between just what others around them are doing. Judaism is not immune to picking up on traditions from other societies around us, or the society that we find ourselves seated in, or for environmental reasons or any number of reasons. There are more people choosing cremation, but it's also one that traditionally Jews don't tend to choose.
I wanted to ask a question, Rabbi. Is there any specific time then to go to the cemetery for specific holidays for the death?
There's a day right before the high holidays that many will choose to do. There's even a ceremony for it. It's not the most commonly done one, but I have seen it done. Some of the cemeteries in LA where I was growing up, I remember one of the places did a day. I think the Sunday before Rosh Hashanah is a day that's not uncommon to choose to go visit, especially the grave of a parent. But and some will choose either at the point of unveiling, is usually done around when the 11 months of Kaddish is done, is when you put in the permanent burial stone or headstone, or some will go for a yard site. I think that this particular question is one where different Jewish communities in different parts of the world have developed it very differently. I know that for a lot of Russian Jewish communities, it's very common to go to the cemetery pretty regularly, and for other parts, it's pretty common not to ever go or to only go for a yard site. So that's one. There's less one Jewish answer than many.
Thank you.
And someone asked, do Jews have to wear black for a certain amount of time like other cultures? I think that wearing black is also one of those ones that we've picked up from other cultures around us. So it's not a requirement to wear black, but many people choose to wear black. And for those who choose to do the tear on their actual clothing rather than on the little ribbon that they can move, they'll tend to usually choose like a sweater. I have a friend who's from Brazil where they don't use those little ribbons, and he would choose a sweater or a jacket so that he can keep wearing that one. So people will wear some people wear the thing that was torn for the entire week of Shiva, which is another reason that American Jews especially have developed this little pin system so that you can move the pin from what you're wearing throughout the week. So we'll choose an outer layer of clothing. But I think us doing it in black clothing specifically is something that we've picked up from other cultures surrounding us. We've just gotten used to funerals, we wear black. The same is true, by the way, of things of wearing white. That's not a Jewish concept necessarily either, but we've picked that up from Queen Victoria, like most of us, the rest of the world. Okay. All right. Thank you all for hanging out a little bit over. Sorry about going a little over, and glad we could answer some more questions. Have a good week, and tune in next week with Rabbi Dennis, and we'll be figuring out some stuff with me after as we move forward.
Goodbye.